Shalom again, my brethren. This video is part 2 of Bajans, Barbadians, Pagans, Heathens, or Yahsarahahl, which is in English, Hebrew Israelites. Again, this is part 2. When the cost of white labor in England went up during the 17th and 18th centuries, the planters in Barbados, on the advice of the Dutch and the Sephardic merchants, turned to West Africa for their source of manpower. At this moment, I just want to make a brief comment with regards to who are the Sephardic. The Sephardic is a people found in the book of Genesis, chapter 10, verse 30. We can read more of their history written also in 2 Kings, chapter 17, verse 24, verse 31, 2 Kings 18, verse 34, 2 Kings 19, verse 13, and also Isaiah chapter 36, verse 19, and Isaiah chapter 37, verse 13. This is highlighted because today in the land of Israel, you have what is known as Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. We should know that these people, in truth and in fact, are not really the true Yahudim, the true Jew. This lesson study seeks to inform you with sound historical and biblical evidence as to who the peoples that are being discussed in this lesson study are. The Dutch, we know that the Dutch are the descendants of Europeans. So to continue now into the lesson study, bear in mind, brothers and sisters, that this lesson study is uncovering and exposing who the so-called Bajans are. It also helps to expose who some of the other peoples that came across on the slave ships that were placed on many other Caribbean islands are. Black slaves were imported in large numbers from the Gold Coast region, in particular, especially from what is now known today as the country of Ghana. For instance, the Ashanti, the Ewe, Fan, and Fante peoples provided the bulk of the imports into Barbados. However, Nigeria also provided slaves for Barbados. Slaves like the Yoruba, the Efik, the Ibu, the El Bibio. These were the main ethnic groups that were targeted. At this very moment here in this video, I want to make mention the scripture Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 10. It says, "From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my supplicants, even the daughter of my dispersed, shall bring mine offerings." We know that in 66 to 70 AD, and primarily 70 AD, we know that most of the Hebrews would have fled into Africa. They would have fled into the west coast of Africa, known today as the Gold Coast. And here we see in Zephaniah, the Most High making mention that his people would come from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. When we look at West Africa, it is divided by that river that comes down through the whole land of West Africa. Hence, the Most High made mention that from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, even the daughter of my dispersed shall bring mine offering. When we see today the West African countries recognizing that they are the descendants of the Hebrews and they're turning back to their true identity, this is a part of that prophecy that is written here in Zephaniah when it says, from beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my supplicants, even the daughter of my dispersed. Well, who was dispersed? The Hebrews were dispersed during the 42 months that they were besieged by the Romans, Titus and Vespasian, from 66 AD to 70 AD. And they went in to the interiors of Africa, the forests of Africa, West Africa to be more specific. This is where we get these tribes that I would have previously mentioned: the Igbo, the Fant, the Ashanti, the Ilbibo, the Efik, and so on. The so-called Christian churches like the Methodists, the Wesleyans, the Catholics, the Lutherans, and yes, in particular, the Anglican Church sought to acculturate the slaves to European patterns after they saw that the slaves were maintaining most of their cultural practices. These practices that the slaves were maintaining were indeed Hebrew practices. Brothers and sisters, I want to now turn your attention to an African slave descendant. His name is Oluda Equiano. At the age of 11, Oluda Equiano and his sister were captured, were kidnapped, and brought to Barbados. He wrote all of this information down in his autobiography. Oluda Equiano was born in West Africa in 1745. He lived near the desert of Seth. This was before the Europeans came to Africa. The name of the area where he lived was the desert of Seth. It was named the desert of Seth before the Europeans came to Africa. So one should be asking the question, well, why would there be a desert called the desert of Seth in Africa even before the Europeans came into Africa? That is food for thought, brethren. As I continue, he was from the Igbo tribe. Oluda Equiano was from the Igbo people of southern Nigeria. Him and his sister were kidnapped after some Hamites. Hamites are the native Africans who were also black people, but not of the Igbo peoples. As we will later discover, Oluda Equiano was also a black person, a person of black skin complexion, but he was not a native African. He was of the dispersal of the Hebrews who came to West Africa. He was one of their descendants living in Africa. The Hamites, the native Africans, jumped over the walls of Oluda's family property and hence kidnapped him and his sister. Then his sister, who was 3 years old at the time, and he being 11, were sold separately. In his autobiography, he makes mention that when him and his sister were separated, he wanted to die. they walked across Africa, being drove to the coast to get to the slave ships. While doing this, they would pass through many of the other Hebrew tribes, villages that were raided. When he reached the Atlantic Ocean, he saw slave ships for the first time, and he called them fortresses on water. He was shipped to Barbados via the transatlantic slave trade. This information can be found, like I said, in his autobiography, which he wrote some years later after he would have purchased back his freedom from his slave master. When Oluda Equiano got to America, he became a blackjack. In other words, a seaman. The first time that he heard the Bible, he said that it made him instantly identified with it because it sounded just like the practices of his people. Oluda, his very name, means of Judah. His people circumcised on the 8th day. And if we notice, most of the people that are circumcised in the world are found in West Africa. Another practice that Oluda's people upheld was the fact that they kept one true God. They practiced also the laws of cleanliness found in Leviticus. They practiced the law of atonement, sacrificing lambs and eating lamb's flesh also, as opposed to the unclean flesh of other animals. Bear in mind, brethren, that this is supposed to be a heathen. This is what the Europeans would have called our foreparents, heathens or pagans. But bear in mind the practices that Oluda Equiano and his family would have been taking part in while living in West Africa. The other nations, the other peoples, the Hamites, they were not taking part in these practices. Bear in mind, brethren, that Oluda Equiano was captured by the Hamites. Him, as well as many of the aforementioned tribes who are part of his peoples, and they were brought over to the Caribbean islands in what is known as the transatlantic slave trade. I will read now a little more information that is taken from Oluda Equiano's autobiography. He wrote, and I quote, "The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea and a slave ship which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death to relieve me. This is taken from Slavery and Economy in Barbados by Dr. Carl Watson, which was updated February 17th, 2011. So I'm reading this to show you that even a historian in Barbados knows who the descendants of the slaves are, because he would have used the autobiography of Oludo Equiano. But he does not, and I repeat again, Dr. Carl Watson does not go any further into exposing who Oludo Equiano and his people were. Remember, these professors and deans and doctors of Caribbean history or West Indian history, they know the truth, but they would not expose the truth. Why? Probably because of fear of ostracism, or because of losing what they would have acquired as a result of the prestige that they have. Who knows what? Anyway, Dr. Carl Watson is senior lecturer in the Department of History of the University of West Indies. And he's also the editor, catch it, he's also the editor of the Journal of the Barbados Museum, the secretary of the Barbados National Trust, chairman of the George Washington House Restoration Committee. So this makes me think, if this is coming from Dr. Carl Watson, and there are other folks like Professor Hilary Beckles, why would they not reveal the information promptly and correctly to the descendants of the so-called Africans that came over on slave ships? Why is this information being held? Why is this information not being made public? I want you brothers and sisters to really start to think. Oludo Equiano represents one of thousands of millions of Hebrews that were captured by the indigenous Hamites, who were also dark-skinned people. These Hamites, the descendants of Noah's son Ham, they knew who the Hebrews were. The dark-skinned Shemites that came down from Israel down to West Africa. These Hamites knew that these Shemites were, and in truth and in fact, the Hebrews. They would have captured us and sold us to the Arabs and to the Europeans. Hence, we were sold in the Arabian slave trade and the Atlantic slave trade, also known as the triangular trade or the European slave trade. Hence, this begs me to remind you that the name of this lesson study is called Bajans, Barbadians, Pagans, Heathens, or Yahsarahahl, Hebrew Israelites. You ask yourself the questions. The answers are there. The history is there. The Bible is there. Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 1 to verse 14 It tells of the blessings that would fall upon the nation of Israel if they were to keep the commandments of Yahuwah. But from verse 15 to verse 68 tells of all of the curses that would befall them if they did not keep the commandments of Yahuwah. And as a consequence, they did not keep the commandments, and hence you have the curses befalling Israel. So now, Bajans, or so-called Bajans that are of descendants of the so-called African slaves, who really are you? I am not telling you who you are. You need to search history and scripture to identify for yourselves who you are. This is the end of part 2 of Bajans, Barbadians, Pagans, Heathens, or Yahsarahahl, better known in English as Hebrew Israelites. Shalom, brethren.